Okay, hello everyone. We're going to get started, and not just the in-person people who are joining us, but we also have a virtual audience as well, which is going to be joining us through this little camera up here watching Scott. So we'll go ahead and get started with Scott's presentation. I'm going to be getting rid of this share and bringing up Scott's PowerPoint, so we'll be with it in just a second. Just a reminder for those who are on the online audience that we will be taking questions after the program, so you can go ahead and put your questions into the Q&A or chat. And obviously you people who are live and here with us will be raising your hands after the end of the program, right?
I guess technically you could be texting it in or something.
Without further ado, I'll let Scott introduce himself a bit further, but go ahead and thank you all for coming, and I hope you all enjoy the program. I'll see you up here for the Q&A session.
Well, hopefully my camera's doing well as far as the good to go, Kyle. Okay. Well, first off, my name is Scott Britton, and I'm the executive director here at the castle. Started about 11 years ago, and have specialized specifically in Civil War history here locally, but also expanded into the settlement of Marietta and Washington County, and that's kind of snowballed over the years. And hopefully, as a result of this, it will create some new projects, just like what we all need, more projects to work on these days. But I'm really excited to be with everyone today and talk about really Marietta's forgotten or overlooked history, and exploring that with this Third Thursday talk. There was a problem that we run into when we do a lot of research. It's very easy to research people like Rufus Putnam or Dr. Samuel Hildreth, Ephraim Cutler, some of those famous white men that came here in the early days of settlement. It's not so easy to research regular tradespeople or people, basic farmers. It's even a little bit more difficult to research women. And I've undertaken the task on this particular program, as you see here on the screen, undertaking the task to explain a little bit of the history of some of the multiracial pioneers that often get left out of the story or get very little mention. This particular story today, we were talking about some programs for Third Thursday, but in the process of that, I started off with the gentleman on the far left, Christopher Melbone. In the process of doing some of that research, I quickly realized I'm not sure I can fill an entire 45 minutes, or you guys would want me to fill an entire 45 minutes on that gentleman. The records are a little bit more sparse, so I've expanded that into 4 different offerings for you this evening. So our first slide to get things started off, this is my shameless plug of saying that I met David McCullough. In September of 2016, I was contacted by local historian Bill Reynolds from Campus Martius Museum, who asked me to give a tour of Mound Cemetery to an author who was doing a research project here in town and looking for some information to write a book. And we discovered that that was actually David McCullough, whose latest book, of course, is The Pioneers, the heroic story of the settlers who brought the American ideal west. In the process of that, when David was here, he did ask those questions. Do you have any stories about women? Do you have any stories about African Americans to include in that story? And is there a way to integrate them into the stories that he was already going to be talking about, Rufus Putnam, Hildreth, and things of that sort? So as he learned, and I learned as well, some of those records are few and far between. Hopefully, maybe in the future, we can do a program on the women. But for tonight, we're going to go into some of the pioneers of Washington County, and specifically here in Marietta. So I wanted to start off with the very first documented African-American pioneer from here in, sorry about that. This is not my computer, so I keep bumping that. I apologize for that. So the first story is about the very first documented African-American pioneer of Marietta, who was actually a young child by the name of JamesDavis. In November of 1785, a detachment of soldiers from the 1st American Regiment was sent from a post near present-day Pittsburgh down the river to build some fortifications at the mouth of the Muskingum River. And that pentagon-shaped fort that you see here was named for its Army commander, General Josiah Harmar of Philadelphia. And the construction was begun and completed sometime in 1786. It was begun in the fall of the previous year. It enclosed about 3/4 of an acre and was located on the west side of the Muskingum River near the confluence of the Ohio, and was part of the posting for our very first regiment in the new American government. The very first American regiment was posted right here in Marietta, Ohio. This was before the Northwest Territory was even formed, and was directly across the river from the one-time state at that time, a slave state of Virginia. As you can see depicted here also, you can see a large partially cleared parcel of land across the river that was purchased by, well, through a tomahawk claim actually, of the Tomlinson brothers in 1773, and they started doing some minor clearing of that area. And then eventually, before Fort Harmar was built, they had cleared some of that away before the Williams family had moved here. So JamesDavis was born March the 6th of 1787, what was now called Point Harmar, the junction of the Muskingum and the Ohio. Unfortunately, this event of his birth was not recorded in the diary of Sergeant Joseph Buell, one of the soldiers stationed there, and later one of Marietta's distinguished citizens. Whether Sergeant Buell was on duty or not at the fort on the day that James was born, or was just completely unaware of the event altogether, is unknown at this point. Unfortunately, I've also found no information at all on James's parents. We will likely never know anything about them. However, one later record, written about the time of JamesDavis's death in 1862, stated that he may have been actually the 3rd African-American born in the Ohio Territory, but was actually the very first mulatto mixed race child born in Ohio itself, being 1/4 Black. So with that, it brought up some intriguing questions. Was his mother a runaway slave seeking refuge here on this side of the river? Was she a free woman of color living just across the Ohio River and looking for a doctor or a midwife that was often at the fort to help her with the delivery? Some of those answers will never come. There's another possibility, however. I found that in Sergeant Buell's diary on March the 15th, just about a week and a half later, Sergeant Buell recorded that Sergeant Judd went with a party of men to assist some inhabitants to move their families to settle near the garrison. Could the mother have been one of these new inhabitants moving to the area, or maybe a possible servant of one of those new Harmar inhabitants? But to add another interesting side note to the James birth story, Isaac and Rebecca Williams would move to the opposite side of the river on March the 24th of 1787, 3 weeks after James's birth. So all of these events are all happening almost simultaneously, and they began immediately finishing the clearing of the settlement on the Virginia side of the river. I found this painting by a Marietta artist, Sala Bosworth, which I believe is part of the collection at Dawes or Britton. I always find this one very interesting because it also brings up new questions with this new story of JamesDavis. Because as you look across the river on the opposite bank, you will see that there are actually some huts and things on the bank there. So is that one of those new inhabitants, residences that they had set up there? Was James and his mother living there at the time the pioneers arrived? The 48 pioneers under General Rufus Putnam arrived on the banks of the Muskingum and the Ohio River in April of 1788. Again, we'll never probably know the answer to that. But I did run across one thing in that death notice from 1862 that was something brand new to me during the research here. It stated that James was brought up in the family of one of the earliest Ohio pioneers here in Marietta. So evidently he was not living with his mother or his family after he was born for whatever reason. Instead, he was adopted or brought in and raised by one of those families. What the circumstances are would be interesting to uncover. He was actually raised in the family of this gentleman. Are there any guesses as to who this is? This is not a drawing that you normally see of this individual. This is not Ichabod Nye. This is Abraham Whipple, the great naval commander here in Marietta, who arrived here in the very early days of the settlement. It's really fascinating that I've never run across the fact that he had raised James as a young child and continued raising them all the way to adulthood. James would live with the Commodore's family until sometime around 1808, which would have made James about 21 years old when he moved away from the area and settled in the western part of the state near Dayton. Just a couple of years after he left Marietta for Dayton, we know that he was a barber at some point, because in 1811, in November 6th, to be exact, of 1811, James was said to have shaved the gentleman on the left, General William Henry Harrison, as he sat on a log the day before the general fought the famous Battle of Tippecanoe, which occurred just north of present day West Lafayette, Indiana. It was there that he fought against the Shawnee medicine man, the Prophet, the brother of Tecumseh. This also was that famous battle that was later incorporated into his political campaign, of course, Tippecanoe and Tyler too. I found it very interesting when I did some of this research that included on the screen here is a straight razor that is engraved with a campaign slogan from that 1840 campaign for General Harrison. It was sold at auction in 2007 for about $1,200. And ironically, it is a straight razor, again, tying into the JamesDavis story, who allegedly gave him the shave. So he was ready to go that next morning when he faced off against the Shawnee. Inscribed on that straight razor is the word Tippecanoe over an image of the general, and etched on the blades of that is Old Tippecanoe. So I guess JamesDavis' legacy truly does live on today. James was also very renowned in the Dayton area for his hunting activities, which he actually learned at a very young age here in Marietta. He had become an expert hunter, and particularly of bears, something we don't see a lot of, fortunately, around here anymore. His obituary, which appeared in the Dayton Journal, stated that during James's lifetime, he had killed 1,249 deer and upwards of 60 bears, the largest of which measured 9 feet 7 inches. That is a very large bear that we don't want to see here in Marietta again. Was said to have been donated to a museum in Cincinnati following his death, but it doesn't mention which one, unfortunately. It'd be interesting to see if that thing was still around. As an adult, James was not only a barber and an accomplished hunter, but he was also said to have been a very skilled violinist as well. Whether James was formerly serving in some capacity with the American armies under General Harrison during that Tippecanoe campaign, Dayton and the place where the battle was fought are not very close together. It's quite a travel to get there. So he had to have been associated with them in some way. We're not sure exactly in what capacity that was done, but just about a year later, he was listed as a quote unquote waiter, W-A-I-T-E-R, for the man pictured here on the left. And that man is General Lewis Cass. So my best guess is the term waiter, as they said it in that particular article, was used in the context of the obituary as the equivalent of a body servant, someone that would tend to the needs of one of the military officers, in this case, General Cass. For those unfamiliar with the name, Lewis Cass was a man who was born in New Hampshire, but he and his family moved right here to Marietta. A lot of people don't know his connection to Marietta. Moved here in 1800, studied law under the future Ohio governor, Returned Jonathan Meigs Jr., and opened a law practice here in town. He would eventually move his practice to Zanesville until he could leave to serve in the War of 1812, with, we presume, JamesDavis at some point serving alongside of him as that waiter. He would go on to be appointed by President Madison as the territorial governor of Michigan. He would resign that post in 1831 to serve as Secretary of War for President Andrew Jackson. He was ambassador to France. He was nearly the Democrat presidential candidate until being defeated by a dark horse candidate named James Polk. He was a U.S. Senator from Michigan. He ran for president again against Zachary Taylor in another presidential run, and finally served as the Secretary of State under President Buchanan. At last but not least, when the Civil War broke out, the Democrat, Lewis Cass, became an outspoken supporter of the Union. You name it, Lewis Cass did it. And again, he's related not only to the JamesDavis story, but to Marietta itself. That you saw there is in Statuary Hall in the Capitol building to represent Michigan. Following James's service in the War of 1812, in whatever that capacity was, he began assisting escaped slaves from Kentucky and Virginia on their journey across the Ohio to Canada as early as 1815. In conjunction with those activities, Mr. Davis was prominently known in the Dayton area as the founder of a group called the American Sons of Protection, and served as its very first president. That organization was the oldest colored benevolent society in the city. And that group was known for their participation in the various Underground Railroad activities from that area leading up to the Civil War. Mr. Davis was also a very devout Christian man and a highly esteemed member of the Wesleyan Methodist Church in the Dayton area. After a very full and amazing life, JamesDavis died on January 17th, 1862, not quite witnessing the end of slavery, but making his mark in Ohio and on the abolitionist movement. Unfortunately, as you see here on the right-hand side, he is buried in an unmarked grave in Dayton's Woodland Cemetery and Arboretum. Our next largely overlooked or forgotten Marietta pioneer is actually closely associated with one of the most famous Revolutionary War patriot leaders in American history, General Israel Putnam Sr. You may have heard the story, of course, of General Israel Putnam, also called Old Put, who was the commander of Connecticut troops that repelled the first British attack at Bunker Hill, and was said to have claimed in an order he gave the now famous command to his troops at Bunker Hill: don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes, then fire low. The other part of that old saying often gets cropped off of there. Old Put's son Colonel Israel Putnam Jr., and I'll simply call him to avoid the confusion, the Colonel, served on his father's staff as an aide de camp during the American Revolution and came to Marietta in 1788 and would be one of the very earliest settlers of nearby Belpre in the fall of 1789. The Colonel initially moved here with one son, Aaron Waldo Putnam, and a black teenager who had also worked as his father's body servant toward the later years of Old Put's life. That young man was named Christopher Melbone, is the subject of this particular part of the story. Within the walls of the civilian fortifications at Belpre, called the Farmer's Castle, which housed around 220 people, the Putnams were associated with that enclosure and were residents of the Belpre garrison soon after arriving. They arrived along with Christopher Melbone, and the people of the garrison very soon came to call him with a new nickname, Kit Putnam. No longer Christopher Melbone, but because he is associated with the Putnam family, they give him the Putnam name, Kit Putnam. So now Christopher, the Colonel, and his son Aaron resided in one of the 13 houses that you see arranged here in the two rows, astride a wide street between the dwellings, surrounded by a 14-foot tall wooden wall for protection. With Farmer's Castle fortifications now being complete, the Colonel decided to return to Connecticut in the fall of 1790 to move the entire rest of the family to their new western frontier home. Christopher and the Colonel, Christopher Melbone, Kit Putnam, and the Colonel's son, Aaron, remained behind to continue clearing the land and assisting the community. However, in the winter of early 1791, open hostility broke out here in the Marietta and Belpre area with hostilities between the native tribes and the new settlers here in the Northwest Territory. So the Colonel, unfortunately, was not able to return until the war was over in 1795, just 4 years later. Dr. Samuel Hildreth's pioneer history book related the following about this young settler. Christopher Putnam, or Kit as he was familiarly called, easy for me to say, must not be forgotten. He was a colored boy of 16 or 18 years of age and was a great favorite with the boys of his age. He was a chosen leader in all of the athletic sports and much beloved for his kind and cheerful disposition. When abroad in the fields cultivating or planting their crops, he was one of the best hands, either for work or to stand by as a sentry. On these occasions, he sometimes took his station in the lower branches of a tree where he could have a wider range of vision and give early notice to the approach of danger. Under the watchful vigilance of Kit, all felt safe at their work, unquote. It's pretty high praise from Dr. Hildreth. Another autobiography of Benjamin Franklin Stone continued with this description of Christopher Melbone in this way, quote, "Among the boys of the Stone garrison, I should have named Kit, a black boy, Colonel Putnam's servant. He was liked as a playmate as well as any white boy. After he was 20 years old and became a free man," which is a question I've got to investigate more, why he was not considered free. I think whether he was doing some sort of indenture or something along those lines, I'm not quite sure. After he was 21 years old and became a free man, he lived with Captain Duvall on the Muskingum and assisted in tending the floating mill and clearing the land on the farm. The floating Duvall mill was a duplicate of the one that had been built in Belpre that is shown here. The Duvall floating mill was situated on the Ohio River there in Belpre, just upstream of the Blennerhassett of the island. Water wheel was turned from natural current, which could then be blocked or released to speed up the wheel. attached to a grinding wheel. They could go through 25 to 50 bushels of grain in 24 hours, according to the strength of the current on the Ohio. Kit worked with both mills, the one in Belpre and the one on the Muskingum River. Benjamin Franklin Stone continued early in the spring of 93, that's 1793. Kit A.W., which is Aaron Putnam, and Major Robert Bradford of Farmer's Castle put their cattle over the Ohio River near the mouth of the Little Kanawha to run into the woods where they would be less exposed to the Indians. While they were in the river, the cattle took fright and all crowded to one end, which is depicted, whoops, I guess I've changed my slides here. This is the floating mill, sorry about that. The Duval floating mill outside of Farmer's Castle. And this particular drawing by Monocroston, in the top left-hand corner, you can see the depiction of the cattle flight into the river. In this particular one, they ran to one end of the boat and capsized it. The cattle swam away. Bradford, Putnam, and Kit clung to the boat until it rose finally, for none of the three could swim. They stood on top of the boat up to their waist in water, calling for help. Two men went out to them in a very, very small canoe. It was not safe to take but one more man back to the shore. Kit, being the shorter of the three, stood deeper in the water and seemed to be more overcome by the situation. Bradford and Putnam, in this case, Aaron Putnam, both said simultaneously, "Take Kit first." It's pretty incredible to consider with the state of relations with African Americans at that time, that they would say to take him first. They did so, and the two men rowed or paddled ashore to the garrison. When they arrived on shore, Kit could not walk. He was helped into my father's house, and again, this is Benjamin Franklin Stone writing this. Only one man returned the second time in that small canoe and secured the other two, Putnam and Bradford, to bring them ashore. They then towed the flatboat ashore, and he finishes his statement by saying, "This is a true statement, and I was the eyewitness." So he witnessed this entire endeavor. The cows didn't have any problem. They just continued swimming over to the West Virginia side, the Virginia side at that time, and went about their business. Kit would move back to Marietta following the cessation of hostilities in the Indian War, and would gain some pretty historical notoriety for two things that occurred in the fall of 1802. The first occurred on August the 13th of 1802, when I believe he became the very first Black man to win a court case in an Ohio court of law. And you can see a copy of the court record here. Obviously, it's very hard to read even when you see it in person, let alone on a screen here. Kit and his attorney, who was David Putnam, another one of the colonel's sons, petitioned the Court of Common Pleas to issue a warrant against a gentleman by the name of Andrew McClure of Waterford. He was ordered to appear in court to face a complaint made by Kit Putnam himself for damages due to McClure's failure to perform services for him. The court stated that Andrew McClure, quote, "hath not kept and performed his several promises and assumption to the said Kit Putnam, and has made of the damage of said Kit Putnam in the amount of $47.30. He would win the judgment along with additional compensation for his legal fees paid to his, I guess you could say his brother, if he's part of the Putnam family, David Putnam, all totaling $80 in the judgment. So that is August of 1802. But an even more monumental event happened, and I will again read about this event from Dr. Samuel Hildreth's story about Christopher Melbone, and one of the most overlooked and little known stories in Ohio history. Quote, "At the election of delegates under the territory to form the Constitution for Ohio, Kit was a voter. This African American is voting here in October of 1802. He was probably the first and only Black who ever exercised the elective franchise in Washington County. As after the adoption of that article, in this case meaning the Ohio Constitution and their admission to the US as a state, all colored men were disfranchised. I love that word, disfranchised, not disenfranchised, but disfranchised. Because of Christopher's valued contributions during the Indian Wars and to the local community as a whole, and this is my commentary here, when it came time to vote on the representatives to attend the Ohio Constitution Convention in Chillicothe to vote on Ohio statehood, this very young, free African-American man was granted the right to vote right here in Marietta. And as you see here on this slide, there are the voting rolls where he is listed. So again, you must remember that these pioneer settlers were not governed by federal laws. They were part of a US territory and therefore not under the federal voting laws. So how do we know that Christopher actually voted? There are actually two different handwritten original copies of those 1802 voter rolls located in Marietta College's special collections that prove all of this is true. In one of them, he is listed as voter number 133, and he's listed as Christopher Putnam. The other handwritten duplicate list is almost exactly identical. Again, these are all not done by a Xerox machine, but by hand. It has one slight difference. Voter number 133 on the other list is listed as Kit Putnam. So we know Kit Putnam, Christopher Melbone, also known as Christopher Putnam, is that same man. So Washington County elected 4 representatives who were instrumental and went to that constitutional convention in Chillicothe that defeated the issue of allowing slavery in the Ohio Constitution. I've also recently learned from a fellow researcher in Athens, Carl Denbo, who's done some research on this particular issue, that the group led by Ephraim Cutler in this particular circumstance was vital in the passage of the Bill of Rights in Ohio's Constitution, similar to what we have in our US Constitution. But during that Bill of Rights debate for the Ohio Constitution, Judge Cutler, who lived just a few miles up the road from here, would play a key role in defeating a provision that wanted to insert the word white into all of these rights of the Bill of Rights for Ohio. That was defeated again by one single vote. So the goal was for some of those delegates to make sure that only white men would have those protections. Who Christopher Melbone voted for, we will never know, but I'm guessing he voted for the abolitionists like Ephraim Cutler, Benjamin Ives Gilman, Rufus Putnam, and I believe the other one was John Matthews from the Zanesville area. By his act of voting legally on October the 12th, 1802, what he did was monumental. I believe he became the first and possibly the only registered voter, legally registered voter in the state of Ohio to vote before the ratification of the 15th Amendment to the US Constitution on February 3rd, 1870. 1802 to 1870. As an aside, Marietta during that time period of the passage of the 15th Amendment went down to the levee and fired a 29-gun salute to celebrate the occasion. After breaking down all of those barriers, both in the courts and also at the ballot box, Dr. Hildreth, who was not living here at the time that Christopher was, recorded in his pioneer history book that Christopher Melbone died about 1802. So again, these court cases in August of 1802, the voting is in October, but sometime in that, either that same year or right around the turn of the next year, he disappears and has died evidently. His final burial spot, like many of the other early multiracial pioneers is also unknown. Our next forgotten Black pioneer from Marietta was a Revolutionary War soldier named Basilel Norman. So I'm going to take a little bit of a diversion before I get to his story, because I'm not sure a lot of folks really realize the extent of the role of Africans playing in the fight for freedom and independence against King George during the American Revolution. For example, arguably the very first casualty in the fight against the British Crown was a free half African American, half Native American sailor by the name of Crispus Attucks, shown here on the left. He was one of the first 3 people killed by British troops on March the 5th of 1770 in what was called the Boston Massacre. On the Lexington Alarm and the fighting from Concord Bridge back to Boston, at least 20 patriots of color were among the Minutemen militias who fought against the British regulars, including the gentleman that is depicted here, Prince Estabrook, depicted here on the right. Prince Estabrook fought under the famous Captain John Parker of Lexington and was wounded on Lexington Green in the shoulder when the first opening shots that were heard around the world started the American Revolution. And by the way, Captain John Parker was the uncle of one of the original 48 pioneers, Captain Josiah Monroe. And one last example before we get back to Basil Norman, General James Mitchell Varnum, shown here on the right, a member of the Continental Congress and one of the very early pioneers of Marietta, who doesn't get a lot of press because he died within the first year he was here, convinced General George Washington and the Rhode Island legislature to raise the first Rhode Island regiment while he was still headquartered at Valley Forge. It was the first time that whites, African Americans, and Native Americans all served in the same regiment in American history. At the end of their service, all of the soldiers of the first Rhode Island were free men. And he came here and organized all of that stuff, came here after his service. So back to our next story with Basil Norman. Marietta and Washington County obviously would have been the destination and residence of a lot of these patriots of the American Revolution, including one of the African American patriots of that conflict. His name was spelled a variety of different ways, and it is really complicated to try to find out how all of the different spellings are done. He's spelled variously Basilel, Basil, or just plain Basil. For the rest of this, I'm going to just say plain Basil as we go along. Basil Norman was born a free man and was a native of Frederick, Maryland. He was raised on a modest tobacco plantation. He served 4 years in the Maryland line and saw extensive combat during his Revolutionary War service. In the fall of 1777, at the age of 17, Basil joined as a private in Captain Richard Anderson's company of Colonel John Gunby's 7th Maryland Regiment. He saw action in the Battle of Monmouth, famous for its oppressive heat, as well as the story of Molly Pitcher, in the late part of June of 1778. He then participated in the Southern campaigns in the Carolinas at the Battle of Camden, Cowpens, Guilford Courthouse, and Utah Springs. But I believe probably his most important battle and service of what we know of his service was the pivotal Battle of the Cowpens. Folks today might recognize it for the climactic scene that you see in the Mel Gibson movie, The Patriot, if you've seen that. As the militia retreat from the field with the British in hot pursuit, a counterattack is made that turns the tide of the battle and is one of the turning points of the war. We know that Basil's individual company, however, played a very pivotal role in the battle itself, as their charge under Captain Anderson helped win the battle by capturing a British artillery battery. The site, which you can, if you go there today, you can actually see where the British cannons were captured by his particular company. One account detailed the actions of Basil's specific company Anderson's company in this way, quote, "Seeing my right flank was exposed to the enemy, I attempted to change the front of Wallace's company of Virginia regulars. In doing so, some confusion ensued, and first a part and then the whole of the company commenced a retreat. The officers along the line, seeing this and supposing that orders had been given for a retreat, faced their men about and immediately moved off. General Morgan, who had been with the militia during that time period, quickly expressed his apprehensions of the event. But as soon as I removed his fears, I pointed out the line and observed that the men were not beaten, but were retreating in order. He then ordered me to keep with the men until we came to a rising ground near Washington's Horse, and he rode forward to fix the proper place for us to halt and about face. In a minute, we had a perfect line. The enemy were now very near us, and our men commenced a very destructive fire, which they very little expected. And a few rounds occasioned great disorder within the ranks. That's the British. While in this confusion, I ordered a charge with the bayonet, which order was obeyed with great alacrity. As the line advanced, I observed their artillery a short distance in front and called on Captain Ewing, who was near me, to take it. Captain Anderson, however, and that's Basil's company commander, hearing the order, also pushed for the same object. He's also going for the same guns. And being emulous for the prize, they don't use that word anymore, being emulous for the prize, he kept pace until near the very first piece, when Anderson, by placing the end of his spontoon, and that's like a big pike or a big spear, he placed it forward into the ground and made a long leap, which brought him up upon the gun and gave him the honor of the great prize. So basically he did a pole vault up onto the top of the gun itself. In the pursuit, I was led toward the right and in amongst the British 71st Regiment of Foot, also called Fraser's Highlanders, who were now broken into squads. And as I called to them to surrender, they all laid down their arms and the officers delivered up their swords. When Captain Anderson's company captured the artillery, they immediately turned them around and used them on the British troops that were now retreating. So we know he was part of that particular action from his pension records. At the end of his war service, Basil was given a gun, a mule, and an $8 a month pension. He also received a bounty land warrant land grant here in Marietta in the 3rd Ward as a payment for his services, just like many of the other veteran settlers of Marietta. He was one of the very first Black landowners of Washington County and therefore the state of Ohio. Basil, his wife Fortune Stevens, love that as a name. Her name was Fortune. Fortune Stevens and his entire family would move out to Roxbury Township, which no longer exists, on the western part of Washington County, where he would pass away July the 17th of 1830 after leaving his home that particular morning to watch a deer lick, presumably going out to go hunting. His final resting place is unknown, but is possibly on the farm near Waterford, which is now in present day Morgan County. In January of this year, for episode 1 of season 8 of Henry Louis Gates Jr.'s Finding Your Roots, if you've watched that program on PBS, it was discovered, one of the participants discovered her multiracial ancestry, and that was uncovered on this particular show. The episode was called Hidden in the Genes, and it discussed the ancestry of Rebecca Hall, an English actress and film director. Ms. Hall was a direct descendant of Basil Norman. She didn't even know she had multiracial background. If you haven't seen it and want to learn more about some of the other members of Basil's group of descendants, I certainly encourage you to watch that. It gives a far more broad background than I can do here in this limited time tonight. I did also want to mention Another direct descendant of Basil Norman is a gentleman by the name of Denver Norman, who was a member of the Marietta chapter of the Sons of the American Revolution here in town. And finally, we have one of our multiracial pioneers who we actually know what he looks like, not just a guess of a drawing and things that we've seen up until this point. This gentleman is named John Stewart, not the comedian. This is the original John Stewart here. His life story really runs the whole gamut of emotions, from good to bad to really ugly, and then inspirational. Many of the details of his life are spelled out in the book with a very, very, very long title, and I'll read it to you here. The Missionary Pioneer, or a brief memoir of the life, labors, and death of John Stewart, man of color, founder under God of the mission among the Wyandottes at Upper Sandusky, Ohio. Yeah, that's got to be a big page, title page, to get all of that information on there. It's about 100 pages long, and the entire thing is available for free to read at your leisure online. John Stewart was born a free man also to free parents in 1786 in Powhatan County, Virginia, which is a western suburb of Richmond today. At the age of 21, so roughly in 1807, John left Virginia for the free state of Ohio and settled here in Marietta. His parents were members of the Baptist church back in Virginia, but as the book referenced, it stated that John was, quote, a careless sinner. He went a different way than his parents, I guess you could say. While on his journey from Virginia to Marietta, however, he was robbed of every piece of his property before arriving here in Marietta. He got here in a terrible state, physically, mentally, and of course, spiritually. He quickly made his bad situation even worse by commencing, quote, a course of excessive drinking at a public house, which was continued until the nerves became much affected and his hand trembled so that it was very difficult to even feed himself. In this practice and condition, he remained for a considerable length of time, still fixed in the determination to destroy his life. At long last, after a couple of or several months, he finally hit rock bottom. In this book, it said that he cried out, quote, "O wretched man that I am, who shall deliver me?" Remembering his verses and things and some of the sermons probably from his childhood. He then resolved to change his life, and that slowly began to kick in some ways, but not all. He got a job making sugar in the woods, just a little bit distant from town. And during that time, he began reading, meditating, and praying on a regular basis. He got another job in the blue dyeing business here in Marietta and continued this religious awakening. However, there was no Baptist church here at the time in Marietta, which was, his upbringing. So he decided to continue his spiritual journey on his own. He did not, however, break his addiction to alcohol. At long last, however, one evening after resolving to finally kill himself and end his suffering life, he heard the sound of singing coming from a house nearby and decided to investigate. It was a Methodist prayer meeting. He joined them and was so moved by the service, he resolved to become a Methodist missionary and to go amongst the Indian population. To make a very long story a little bit shorter tonight, I invite you to read that book online because he had long last found his calling in life and the calling in the world, and he did completely change his life. Living here in Marietta, became the very first Methodist missionary in all of North America. Let that sink in. He became the first Methodist missionary in all of America. It's a really great redemptive story. He did this in 1816, traveling between Marietta and Upper Sandusky, Ohio, and began his interactions in ministry with the Wyandot Nation along the Great Lakes. He traveled back and forth between the two places, and also during that time period became a mediator between the native tribes and the white settlers that were growing in great number in that particular area. He continued that missionary work for the remainder of his life. A year after his death, a stone meeting house, which is shown here, was built by a Methodist circuit rider named James Finley. The house of worship in northern Ohio was used by the Wyandot tribe until their forcible removal from Ohio in 1843. At some point, he stepped away for a time in order to properly be licensed. So in November of 1822, Athens County Court of Common Pleas recorded a license granted to John Steward, with a D, to be a minister of the gospel for the Methodist Episcopal Church, allowing him to solemnize the rites of matrimony between any persons legally applying to him for that purpose in the state of Ohio. One of the great mysteries is, why did he go to Athens and not here in Marietta? John would marry in the winter of 1818 to a wife named Polly, a woman described as, quote, quite an intelligent young woman, yet she was not religious at all. It's interesting for a missionary. Through the instrumentality, however, of her pious husband, it is believed that she became the subject of saving grace. However, John's marriage and John's ministry did not last long, as he died in 1823, the year of the great sickly seasons that killed so many of our founding fathers and mothers here in Washington County, in just the 7th year of his missionary work. John and Polly had no children, and like the other three forgotten pioneers of Marietta, his final burial place is unknown. However, John left a lasting legacy, not only here in Marietta, but obviously across America and across the world. That legacy is most notable in the early 1900s when an African Methodist Episcopal Church, an AME church, was founded at 7th and Warren Streets, called the John Stewart Memorial Church, nearly 100 years after his death. The house is still there. It's now a private residence. It went through a number of different changes over the years. It was originally an Episcopal church called St. Andrew's, and then was purchased by some members of the Marietta community and named for him and his ministry. In the late 60s, it was associated with Gilman Methodist Church on Colgate Drive. And at one point, or at what point, I'm not sure exactly when it closed. Maybe some of the folks here remember that or know the exact date of when that building shut down and became a private residence. And I'll finish my program this evening just to mention that this research tonight has just scratched the surface record of our multiracial past here in Marietta. And it is my hope that working with local groups and other interested researchers that we'll be able to develop a multiracial tour of Marietta and Washington County. I've already been in touch with the Tourist and Convention Bureau about this within the next year or so, and share some of this little known history and often looked area of research. I'll finish my program as I often do, or almost always do, with the photo of the tombstone in the center here, placed in nearby Oak Grove Cemetery, that memorializes the unknown pioneers of Marietta, whose names have largely been lost to history. And this truly applies to all 4 of these inspirational Black pioneers of Marietta. At the bottom of that memorial stone to those pioneers, it has the inscriptions, "Names pass away, but deeds live on." I still get choked up doing that every time. Sorry about that. And with that, I thank you very much for your attention. Okay, so I'm going to, before we start the Q&A, I just wanted to alert everyone to a couple of different upcoming programs that we have going, one of which is a cemetery tour that I'll be leading over in Harmar. Kind of ties into this talk as well. The Anti-Slavery Freedom in Harmar tour, talking about some of those Underground Railroad participants, a family, the Muncie family, four young men who joined the Union Army as white men. They're multiracial. They passed themselves off for white men so they can serve starting in 1861 in their store as well, along with a gentleman who was enslaved, was liberated from Fredericksburg, Virginia, and joined as a servant for General Rufus Dawes, one of the descendants is here in the audience tonight, and served alongside in 20 different battles with their commander, General Rufus Dawes, from here in Marietta. So I'll be telling his story as well. And the last one I'll mention as well, there is a project underway with the Civil War Roundtable of the Mid-Ohio Valley that I'm associated with and helped found. We are in the process of raising money for the woman is here on your screen on the left. That is Charlotte Scott, who was a resident here in Marietta. Her house was down on Putnam Street, right next to the City Hall buildings and the Baptist Church. And she was part of a project. She didn't know it at the time. She donated $5 to start raising money to memorialize the great emancipator, Abraham Lincoln. When word was given at her house that Lincoln had been assassinated, she gave $5 to a local minister, who then started a fundraising campaign. Over $16,000 were raised for the very first memorial to Abraham Lincoln. And it was all based on her $5 donation, all raised completely from formerly enslaved or U.S. colored troops during the Civil War. So we're in the process of raising money for that. And you can go to the Civil War Roundtable of the Mid-Ohio Valley to find out more information about that project and make a donation if you're so inclined. And Kyle also has some news about an upcoming program at the end of the month.
So I'm going to switch everything over so we can engage our online audience and make sure that we're having them answer our questions as well. All right.
While he's doing that, I'll just kind of introduce the topic. On April the 30th, Kyle and some of our volunteers are going to be part of a living history here at the castle on the 30th, a World War I program called Over Here.
Yep. Yeah, so over here is going to be outdoor displays from 11 to 4 on April 30th, representing the local National Guard troops that were stationed here in Marietta, as well as the Women's Relief Corps preceding the American Red Cross that kind of started off here in April of that year. And we also will having specialized tours on the hour from 1 o'clock through to 4 o'clock. So if you take a tour, you will be greeted by the members of this house who became very much involved in the efforts to aid the war effort. And so we'll be meeting the family members that lived here, the Davis family and their maid. So you'll have a chance to kind of interact and be involved with a first-person interpretation, costume interpreted event here. So hopefully you'll find that of interest and be able to attend. But other than that, we can move on to our Q&A session. So Scott, if you have questions from the audience, and I will...
Yeah, we'll start off with some questions from the audience, and I'll go back over to the microphone, and that way folks online can also, I'll repeat the questions and be happy to try to answer any questions that you might have. Yes?
We were talking about JamesDavis, and there was a historical marker.
Yes.
Where is that marker located?
Yeah, so that particular marker is talking about the Underground Railroad in general, and because he's an Underground Railroad participant, not here, that he starts that over in Dayton. That particular marker is over on the west side near the Anchorage, talking about the Underground Railroad movement, and particularly most of that marker is about the Putnam family, David Putnam, which would be the grandson of the one that represented Kit, and his work on the Underground Railroad. I'll be talking about his grave at Harmar Cemetery. It ties them all together. But yeah, that particular marker, you can read about that and the court case that David Putnam was involved with. That was really a national type of case with Henderson Hall and helping some of the runaway slaves from that plantation to escape from freedom on this side of the river. So, other questions from the? Yeah, Jerry.
Is the research for African Americans in Washington County really sparse? I mean, did you really have to dig to find this information?
Yeah, there is a lot of records, and there's more digital type of things available now. Some of those records and things of that sort. Can you not hear? Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, thanks, Kyle. Yeah, the question was, are the records pretty sparse around this area as far as specifically African American research? The Church of Latter-day Saints brought a team in here several years ago and digitized a lot of records. So things like court records and deed records, and a lot of those things are online. Most of it's not indexed yet, although some of the index books are digitized. So it's a very long and laborious project to go through some of that. But it is very sparse. The good part is Washington County has a lot of records and was pretty good about keeping records from the very first part of their settlement. So a lot of those court records and things of that sort have survived. But, just like records for women, unless you showed up in the courtroom or, was involved in some sort of court case, unless you bought land, a lot of the African Americans did not. Women did not. They're on the deed records when the property was sold. That was always done by the husbands, and then they would show up to basically make their mark or sign off when the property was sold. But they're really, really difficult, both women and multiracial families to find research on that. Yeah, Carol.
How is it known that JamesDavis was 1/4 Black?
The question is, how was it known that JamesDavis was 1/4 Black? It is in his Dayton death notice. So whether that is someone who wrote it up in the Dayton area that knew him very well and evidently had talked to him about that, I've never seen that anywhere else. But the fact that it was listed in that particular notice in 1862, he's listed as mulatto in most of the records, but it doesn't get that specific until that one specific record.
That is weird because so little about him is known. And
Correct.
they don't even have a named grave site for him.
Correct.
And yet someone reported this fact, a supposed fact,
It,
of his DNA. It's very
yeah,
bizarre.
well, and again, he had the fortune of passing away in 1862. So unlike a lot of these other ones who died in the 1820s, those records are really sparse because there's not a whole lot of newspaper records either. The other amazing thing is his death notice is very large, actually. And it was repeated, or parts of it were repeated in a number of different newspapers. I've got a subscription to newspapers.com, and you can see those in various places around. Some things have been digitized, some not. But his death notice or mention of his death is in several newspapers all around, certainly around Ohio, but around the whole region. Because in many cases, he was known as the very first African-American born in Ohio, period. Now, that one notice that also says that he's 1/4 Black also said he was the third Black man born in, or mixed race, or mixed African blood, I think is what they termed it, born in Ohio. So again, my guess is some of that, there was some sort of discussions of people born in other areas that were not part of the settlement here. In fact, the settlers weren't even here when he was born. The area up like Grenada, Hutton, and some of those other things, those were not sanctioned settlements, obviously, before the settlement here. So maybe there's some particular documentation of those type of things that documented a couple of those. They didn't say who those other people were that they claim were the first, but it did say that he was the first mulatto. So evidently the other ones were all black in that, that type of thing in that context. But it does, if it does make a little bit of sense to me, or speculation anyway, that if he did, if his mother was here, that she was probably a free woman of color, just like all those other ones were free when they came here. That a lot of them would have been mixed race heritage. And so goes with a lot of the other local research that you run into. The mothers are often mixed race. So therefore you end up with the quarters or the eighths and things of that sort. In fact, I've got that in my own family. Ironically, his name is JamesDavis, which is what got me pulled into this particular story. I have a great-great-grandfather named JamesDavis, who was an African-American or a mulatto, depending on the records, born in the Washington County Infirmary here in Marietta. And his parents could not care for him and his brother. And at that time, all the kids, along with adults, were at the infirmary. And a lady by the name of Catherine Fay Ewing decided to start a place for those children. And he was one of the first handful of children, him and his brother, that were brought into her home out in Moss Run. And as he grew up, and he's out in that isolated area, his name was Davis, JamesDavis. No one had any idea who his background was, who his parents were. He was also mulatto, either a quarter or a half, and was light complected. I've got numerous pictures of him. And he passed himself off once he became an adult as a white man for the rest of his life. So trying to find those records are extremely difficult. He was born in the infirmary. So it's kind of like being born at the Porn at Harmar. So we got maybe one more question. I don't see any other ones here online. Yes, Judy, go ahead.
I seem to recall on one of the cemetery tours that you gave me on the cemetery, that a portion of that cemetery was dedicated to African Americans. Am I wrong about that? And I thought you said Christopher Melbone was buried in that section.
No, yeah, Christopher Melbone, to my knowledge, I've not seen any records of him being buried. It would make sense that he would be buried because the first burial at Mound Cemetery is in 1801. But there is, as you walk into the gates of Mound Cemetery, in the far back left-hand corner, very near Rufus Putnam and a lot of the other founding fathers and mothers of Marietta, that is an area that is specifically a mixed race area. Later on, there are some other very early founders. There are two women who have mixed background that are buried in the front part of the cemetery as well. So not that I've found in any of the records, and we've gone through that. So and with that, we're going to go ahead and wrap up the online program. If folks want to stick around and have some more questions, we'll certainly do that. But again, we want to thank you all for joining us this evening, both online and here in person. And I'm excited to continue this as a jumping off point, and hope that some of you can join me in this effort to bring about more of these stories and get these really heroic and stories out into the public and make them more common knowledge. So thank you for coming.